cítit, feel,
Feel. The first thing that comes to my mind is that to feel is about feeling. It's always happening in the very moment, and it's an embodied sensation. So it's a sensory experience that then translates into an embodied relationship to an atmospheric material space. And it's always a moment to moment experience. So I don't regard feelings as something subjective or personal, perhaps not even connected so much to emotions, but more so to the capacity to be affected, and that capacity translating into a sensorial experience. Even just sitting here, I think it becomes very apparent we're sitting in this forest. It's just raining and the last drops are falling. I can see the heaviness of the water on the leaves, and I can smell sort of like this moisture rising from the ground and from every direction. I'm sort of inhaling this air, so it's more like being embraced or encapsulated by environments that then sort of diffuse into the human being that is experiencing it. And in that way, it's more about the interconnectedness rather than a one-way street.
ja, self,
Self. My name is Lea Maria Spahn. I'm a visiting researcher at this point at FAVU in Brno. But the last 6 years, I've been a faculty member of the Philipps University of Marburg, which is a university town in central Germany. I was involved there in the department for sports science and motology. Sports science may be very clear. Motology is um, a field of study that is about embodied therapy and well-being, really. And I was there in the sociology of the movement, or in sociology of movement being a field of study that's really looking not only at movement and embodiment from a philosophical and educational perspective, but also puts it into a larger frame of societal conditions, contemporary changes in the way that we understand the social as socio-technological intertwinement and entanglements, and really finding a way through that, or yes, entering it analytically to make sense of what bodies are and how they are experienced in this time. Yes, and the second part of myself really that has led me to Brno at this time is that I've been dancing pretty much my whole life. Did a qualification as dance pedagogue and have been performing throughout the last years, very much with a focus on the relations between body and environment. I got to know a Czech performer in these workshops between that were set in Germany and in France, and that became a very good friendship and also artistic, yes, in a way, an artistic friendship that has sparked many more actions and collaborations. So that's the other side that led me to actually apply to this residency here in Brno, and I've been here for 2 months. And we will now enter actually some more workshop time for the next 2 months.
území, territory,
Territory. This is a word that's really hard to relate to from my side because for me it implies this a militaristic taking over and claim. It really has this notion of claiming something. And that, of course, is the case in academia. There is um, the path of writing a dissertation, and in a way, you arrive at the very end claiming your own thesis or positioning yourself within a field of studies. At the same time, I struggle with this term um, in this, yeah, with this association of claiming something, because for me, it's rather about curiosity and the continuity of bewilderment and perhaps also enchantment with your field of study. So in my dissertation that I really just finished 6 months ago, so it's still very fresh, and at the same time, it's been a long way leading up to a point of I can submit this paper. And my dissertation is called Biography Matters, a feminist phenomenological inquiry into movement practices, improvisation movement practices. So I did an ethnographic research on a group of women that meet weekly and do improvisation dance. And it's a transgenerational group, so it's women between mid 20s and mid 60s, which is a specialty or a uniqueness of the group. And also the term women is in a way questionable because from a feminist perspective, this this implicated we or homogeneity is not a given one. So my field of study is also an intersectional, well, it was an intersectional study in the way that it thinks that subjectivities are always fields of interlinkage of different um, social positions and also ways of being categorized, addressed, and subjective, well, being subjected to something. And from, well, the 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 main goal of this dissertation, or the main outcome of this dissertation, was on the one hand to have an analytics or a description, a mapping of the practices that are done in improvisation, which were reflecting, touching, seeing and being seen. Um, and the last one I can't think of right now. And so, on the one hand, there was this mapping of practices that are done, and on the other hand, it was really a study of how can I describe not only movements and bodies from my perspective as a researcher from outside, but how can I also make sense of the lived experiences of these bodies and their subjective intervention into practices, the possibility and capability to change routines, to have some, and in a political way, also to transform normative orders by inhabiting them, resisting them, and also collectively addressing them. So it was really, in a way, a space of collectivity and of collectively addressing what it means to have a body, what it means to be a body. And on top of that, um, how to relate to bodies that are vulnerable and aging. So this notion or this dimension of aging bodies, bodies that transform and that are not only vulnerable but also like um, ending or that will die at some point. So that was a dimension that entered into the space as well, and that entered the dissertation. From this interest in the lived body um, as a subjective experience, I'm now moving into a more post-human perspective where I want to broaden the sense of bodies, not only to human bodies, but to materialities as a whole, and also taking into consideration post-colonial and feminist critique um, that um, relates the notion of the human being and the body into like a lineage of thinking, um, and well, from yes, in a way, from male thinkers and male philosophers that claim universality of experience, and so the situatedness of experience is now more and more important in my in my current research, but also this field of tension between while I am entering into research as a human being and do make sense of that through my very body as a site of experience and encounter. How can I still come close to like become more sensitive to and also um, become more of a collaborator in my site of in my research site or in the context that I'm doing research in. So now when I'm in my current project that is called Landscapes as Memoryscapes, I want to look at landscapes um, as interplay between human practices and material agency over the course of time. So this dimension of temporality and overlapping and contesting time zones of existence enter.
Ten druhý. The other.
The other, as I just mentioned, my dissertation was very much concerned with human bodies and arrived at this thesis that human bodies are ever incomplete, are always more than coherent, are a multiplicity of subjectivities. And with the other, we're moving even deeper, I would say, because we're asking, so where do these bodies end? Do they end at their skins, or do they perhaps con- well, do they perhaps exceed this seeming boundary? Um, and how can we look at bodies as something relational? How can we look at relationalities from a more than human perspective, from a non-human perspective? And I think this is where this whole field of thinkers now enters into the field of study, the post-human thinkers, critical feminists that introduce this notion of the post-human not being something beyond the human, but the interconnectedness um, between entities and different materialities. Posthuman is also a critical thinking, sort of rejecting this idea of the sovereign body or the sovereign subject, but really, as I said before, the vulnerable and interconnected relational way of being in the world. And the other, in this way, the other is a theoretical position um, referring to the non-human, more than human, um, but it's also the question of how could we think of these encounters of different materialities as a practice of kinship, meaning that kinship is not something in the sphere of the human social, or bound to the sociality between humans, but really is more about the ways of living together and having a common ground as different beings, life, yes, on this planet. So there's this planetary dimension to it, even as yeah, Bruno Latour perhaps will call it, that terrestrial. Um, Feminist thinkers and also post-colonial thinkers are really looking at different epistemic orders and criticize the Eurocentric perspective of subjectivity and sociology. So with this new line of thinking, or it's not so new anymore actually, but with this line of thinking, questions arise of how can we look at the interconnectedness of different bodies. Astrida Naimanis, for instance, she developed a post-human phenomenology where she um, looks at bodies of water as something to make sense of how water as the majority, like as the element that really vitalizes or vitalizes human bodies, that it's really just flowing through human bodies in different forms and passages, and that by entering it brings this whole historicity of where it has been before through rain, pipelines, industrial production, or in the sea, in a lake. And then it exits human bodies again and really comes back into an environment. So this circularity and also this um, yeah, a global terrestrial circularity is introduced by her through her thinking, which I find very enlightening in the way that she makes it very, very concrete how water, um, how bodies are not sort of entities, but more so fields of flows um, that are very open to their surroundings and that are part of their surroundings, and also will be affected by global injustice or global pollution, so that polluted waters will affect certain people more than others. Um, so she not only thinks about this global relatedness and interrelatedness, but she also brings in this political thinking of how do we actually perceive of environments and how are we part of the environment.
Horizont. Horizon.
Horizon. Horizon in the way that comes what comes to my field of perception is the point where we start talking about this project of crossing borders. Hanna Magdalena and I, we met in a French-German performance project, as I mentioned before, and we participated for 2 years and meeting again and really meeting as performers in what we called on the project empty space. And from this empty space emerged this idea that we want to work together, that we want to broaden this European context of between France and Germany, also to Czech Republic, as Hannah is Czech. She's currently a student at FAVO in the performance studio with Thomas Ruller, and she's about to finish her master's thesis at this point. So after these 2 years, we had the chance to find the German-Czech Future Fund, which is who are giving grants to applicants who focus on Czech-German friendship or Czech-German relations. And we came up with this idea of crossing borders being a project where we want to address these two nations, these two nationalities, but also us as young Europeans um, who want to work together but who certainly come from different backgrounds culturally. And the first project was centered around this idea of crossing borders physically, but also in the way that we wanted to bring together different artistic fields and see how can we find a common source of a creative process. How can we find? How can we interact, discuss, perhaps even argue about the ways that we create and understand performative arts? It was depicted in this picture that is uh, a naked torso in a landscape. So we already had this idea of also bringing and considering, taking into consideration more so the landscapes that we live in, and we're understanding crossing borders also within this with this notion of nature cultures by Donna Haraway, who doesn't want to draw a line or to draw the line of difference between nature and culture, but really perceives it as something intermeshed, and I think this was the first step into collaborative work like that. So in a way, crossing borders as a project that we envisioned was about bringing young artists from different fields together, from different nationalities too, um, to have a space for creation together and to create a, sort of like a conference, but a performative conference.
Lokální, local.
Local. The first year of Crossing Borders was called Performing in Between, and we had this open call for participants and were granted a residency in Lashkov, close to Olomouc, in cooperation with Gallery XY in Olomouc. So everyone arrived to Lashkov, to this very tiny town somewhere in the countryside, by train and bus, and then by walking. Hanna Magdalena being sort of being the host in a way. She was there a couple of days earlier and prepared. We had this old train wagon there and some tents. We had an outside kitchen and this um, this little this little pond. No, it was even a little river that we could use where we installed this outside shower. So it was very basic, and there were 5 participants from Czech Republic and 3 or 4 from Germany that came together for these 12 days to work together, and each of them bringing their own ideas about what can I do in this time and what can I offer to the group as well. So when we arrived, we also got to know the environment first of all. We were in this forest, very foresty area. We had our headquarters in a way, where we could be and take shelter, have food. We had a fireplace to prepare the food and had some helpers, Tess and Kuba, who were really sort of providing this homey atmosphere. And at the same time, we all dispersed into all different directions in over the days to do our own research by encountering this place. And what was most interesting to me personally was that very shortly before we arrived, there was this flood. So in a way, this whole landscape was brushed into the direction of water flowing, masses of water flowing. So you could still see masses of tree trunks and bits of wood just piling along the river. The whole grass was just brushed into one direction, And people we met from this area also told us that it was really like a devastating flood that happened there, and that has really reshaped this whole this whole landscape there. And I think this really became part of the project because we saw how the force of water would change a landscape, and how we had to deal with how we had to deal with it. And we ended up creating little pieces for final performance, for final public performance, realizing that wherever we went as performers, there was the stage. I think this was one of the most insightful experiences for me, that there is no stage needed when you work in environments. But really, wherever you find a place of interest or where you stay, that's where a stage emerges. So looking back, the first crossing borders. Yeah, so the first Agronaut project. So looking back, the first Crossing Borders project brought together 12 young artists from different fields, from dance to theater, Otto Kaupinen being one of them, Lisa Hövelborn-Belida, who is an anthropologist but also a performance artist, Hannah, who is an environmental activist actually, and who entered. We also had a social worker who's interested in the field of Buto. So that were very different approaches to performance that came together in these 12 days to find how can we co-create, how can we work together, and how can we allow something to emerge from the difference that we have. And perhaps it's also important to mention that we did take into consideration we will be in a natural space. We will be sort of hosted by a landscape, by this place there. So what's the first thing to think of is how can we be respectfully treating that place too, starting with how do we buy food, how much waste do we produce, what kind of soaps do we use. So we try to create this performative conference with this notion of including the space that we inhabit for that time, um, from an ecological perspective and also from a sustainable perspective.
Přistání. Landing.
Landing is really related to our final performance, or the development towards it, which happened over the days. And at some point, I think through this imagination or through the relation to Stalker, which is a movie by Tarkovsky and which Otto Kaupinen sort of brought in as a narration, as and also as a way of being very humble in a natural space that has its own force, fields of fields of gravity even, and its own I want to say um, agency. Yes, it really has its own agency. So over the course of this performance workshop, we became very humble to this area that had just been very much destroyed actually by the flood, but was sort of recuperating, and us being observant of the little and big changes. And so we came to this little pond that was in the area that was dried out, and dried out day more and more day by day. And at the same time, it sort of created this natural scenery for a performance that then turned into a collective, the first collective performance of all performers, where um, Otto became a character that sort of in a very mysterious and mysterious and also almost mystical way, had to encounter this pond, to leave a sign, perhaps even a sign of hope in this field of destruction. And so he really became an impersonation of dealing with anthropogene intervention in human, like in nature, in natural spaces. Um, and then he had to leave the project early. So on the night of the performance, we actually showed his performance, him being absent. So the artist wasn't even present, but we showed his performance on from 3 different angles on 3 different mobile devices to the public on that pond. So it was a site-specific performance that was technologically mediated from different angles, and even the artist not being present anymore. So it was this play with presence and absence, with um, performative engagement with environmental issues, and at the same time, like not being educative, but more so giving a sensorial, like a sensory experience, and offering a place of discussion and thinking about it. And then discussing with some of the audience, they told us that really this flood was came through the breaking of a dam, of a human-made dam, that was just another failure of human intervention or human planning of natural flows of water, which really upsurged this kind of engaged discussion in our group, and culminated into a manifest, which was called The Landing of the Agronaut. And the Agronaut now being this fictional character that Otto was the impersonation of, but then really became a metaphor for this first performance conference. And the Agronaut was was imagined as a new species that resists a society based on economical growth, that survives ecological changes and reclaims coexistence and co-participation between humans and nature. Um, so really, we introduce this wanting, this desire, and a space for ethical transformation between human and natural nature relationships. And here again, I think we can lean on scholars such as Donna Haraway, who think of nature cultures and this, and who really brought to light this notion of kinship. And we can rely on perhaps more materialist thinkers who really grant agency to other materialities, to environments, and who don't grant agency only to human beings. And so the agronaut too is a species at this. It's a junction point at this crossing point. And really, I think this is also a nice metaphor for crossing borders. So we created this fictional species of the agronaut that now lives on in our projects.
Globální. Global.
Global. After we finished the first project of Crossing Borders, Hannah and Otto and I really decided we're interested to keep on working together. So over the course of 1 year, we had these meetings and came up with another project idea, to really go deeper into this crossing borders and create a project that is taking place on the German-Czech national border. And again, we applied for the Czech-German Future Fund and received some money, and came up with a journey starting in Železná Ruda to Nové Údolí over the course of 10 or 12 days. And again, also had an open call inviting people and participants from different countries who have an interest in working in the fields of performative arts and environmental issues. So there was already the shift from this notion of the agronaut that really manifested itself into the planning of a next project. So the second year in Shumawa was a backpacking journey from emergency camp to emergency camp, long journeys through a landscape that is not only the German-Czech cross like borderline or border space, but also a national park. But special in the way that in the core zone, there's really the absence of human management. And we were lucky to meet a ranger there, for instance, during our journey, who really explained to us and called our attention to how an ecological system functions in the absence of humans very well. It doesn't need human management, but more so that it's so intricately connected that dead tree trunks will be the humus for new life to emerge, that stones in roots are needed for these special kind of birds to crunch protein in the wintertime. And at the same time, he really also called out how this iron curtain that just was built straight through this landscape not only divided human beings, but also animal populations. And that journey, as exhausting as it was with the long walks, um, really made us more understanding, made us even more humble towards environments in their organizational power and in their interconnectedness between different organisms and beings that rely on each other, just as not only we communicated, but also everything around us seemed to be in communication. Special about this journey was too that the walking, or this this mode of walking from place to place and not really having um, a home to return to, but more sort of being on the way became very important, because we realized the journey itself was like the fourth facilitator. Not only Hannah, Otto, and I decided what kind of performative interventions or tasks to do, how to discuss with the group, and how to invite um, certain times for performative research. But really, the weather, the places we we slept, um, the changes in landscape, they all influenced us as a group very deeply. And and then too, this crossing of the borders. So we spent some time in the Czech landscape, on the Czech line side of the border, and then we crossed to Germany. And we also had a talk with a, a tour guide who sort of introduced us into this area where this no man's land really during um, the time of the Iron Curtain, where people were transported between the countries to arrive to the West, but also where lots of families were just resettled, forcefully resettled. So there was an emotional aspect to it that we met and that we really could feel with this person talking to us, that history not only influenced the people there, but also created a very special landscape of ruins, of uninhabited land, and of cities that were forcefully um, vacated. Um, yeah, so this journey through Shumava um, highlighted even more this the way that that we as humans have shaped history and landscapes, so that environments are really and here I introduce this notion of the memoryscapes again, that landscapes are depictions and are lively memoryscapes of historical events, of materialities, and of the human beings, um, or of human interactions. So after these 10 days of walking, um, we we ended in a vacated or abandoned village even that was inhabited by woodworkers, and at some point, um, well, the new generations left, so now the only remains were ruins and some church in the middle of the forest. During these 10 days, we had also done little tasks as group and as individuals that then led to a performative sort of a performative space in that abandoned village where each participant um, gave an insight into their journey, their 10 days journey, and their what they took from it. And so everyone found their own way of expressing digesting and expressing these experiences. So it was site-specific performance along the way in different parts of this village that was non-existent. And that also made us realize again that performance did not happen, like doesn't need a specific space, but it's more about this act of relating to a space. And that again, that also made us realize, looking back now, that it's not about this fictional character of the agronaut per se, but it's really more about this activity. So we changed from a species of agronaut to more of an activity of agronauting, being more like a lifestyle that is respectful to its surroundings, but also not ignorant or not naive um, about differences and human the way that like the way that we do shape the world, but also bringing in this interest in learning about spaces, and by that understanding a little more, becoming more attentive to the micropolitics of an ecology.